Mark Twain did not like novels. That was the story he told about himself, and his closest friends knew better than to challenge it. After Twain's death, William Dean Howells mused that his friend, quote, did not care much for fiction, and in that sort he had certain distinct loathings. Howells went so far as to lovingly characterize Twain as, quote, unliterary in make and manner, a description that would have delighted his friend. But Twain's bookshelves tell a different story, one corroborated in his journals, letters, and published writing, which includes some of the most well-read, rigorously intertextual stories in US literary history. Even if we sketch his most famous works gesturally, their resemblances and allusions to early novels are obvious. His time-traveling knight-errant in A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court is a modern Don Quixote. He calls his travel narrative Innocents Abroad, quote, the new Pilgrim's Progress. Huck Finn's relationship with Jim, as I'll explore in detail in what follows, is an inversion of the Robinson Crusoe relationship with Friday. And Pudd'nhead Wilson picks up on the question of whether placing a socially doomed baby in the care of a wealthy aristocrat can result in durable class transformation, a question raised quite famously by Henry Fielding's Tom Jones and relitigated in American reprints during the middle of the 19th century. The last of these comparisons Twain might refute. He thought Fielding was among the, quote, beastliest of 18th century novelists, but he also readily acknowledged that Fielding's old bad book was still on his and everybody else's bookshelves more than 100 years after its initial publication. Scholars have taken great pains to reconstruct Twain's reading life in order to say with certainty what literary heritage informed his own novelistic achievements, and nearly all of these scholars have resigned themselves to two truths. One, that Twain read widely, voraciously, and sometimes strangely across genres, periods, traditions, and forms, often in ways that cut against the prevailing tastes of his age. And two, that at best, our understanding of Twain's literary influences is partial. Many of his books were sold or given away, both by Twain and by his heirs, to settle debts or to simplify one of his family's many long-haul geographic moves. And his copy of Robinson Crusoe, which would go on to profoundly influence his own novels, was simply forgotten on a train car. He narrates the incident to his wife Olivia as follows. I was so tired last night that I slept soundly in the cars, and I really feel refreshed this morning, a rare experience in railway travel. I read 3 pages of Robinson Crusoe, lost and found the book some 12 or 15 times, and finally lost it for good a couple of hours ago. It is just like me. I must have a nurse. That Twain takes pains to reconstruct this episode of failed train car reading tells us on the one hand that he thought of his library as a set of tools for ordinary life, not keepsakes to be shelved. And on the other, that his was an expansive definition of literary encounter. The overwhelming evidence points to Twain having conducted careful readings of each of the many novels he invokes in his work. Thanks to Alan Gribben's dogged efforts to reassemble Twain's scattered library, we can say with certainty that he not only owned at least one, and often multiple editions of each of the works that critics now agree represent the early genealogy of the novel, but also that he collected and annotated these volumes during the years that he was beginning in earnest to think about himself as a novelist. He had at least 7 versions of John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, for example, 3 versions of Robinson Crusoe, not counting the one he lost, a rare 1749 edition of Fielding's beastly Tom Jones, and an equally precious 1740 edition of Samuel Richardson's Pamela. Those last 2, those are the original dates of publication. Among all of these volumes almost all of these volumes bear inscriptions or publication dates that point to them entering Twain's library at the height of his productive years. And by the time he wrote A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, his most referential and critical assessment of the novel's evolution from medieval chivalric romance to his own historical moment, he had read and reread them all. Nevertheless, in his speaking and writing, and even in his private correspondence, Twain wanted the record to reflect a more casual belief in the cultural significance of the novel, even as the centuries that had elapsed since its earliest emergences had begun to transform the volatile popular form into a vaunted aesthetic tradition. In a 1902 speech at the 19th Century Club in New York, he flippantly defined a literary classic as, quote, something that everybody wants to have read and nobody wants to read. This remark, which has been quoted and misquoted in volumes of Twain's memorable witticisms, is something I want to invite us to take seriously. Not because it accurately reflects his private attitudes as a novel reader, but because it tells us something important about the future he saw for a genre that was running into yet another set of media and technological revolutions in the last quarter of the 19th century. The era of mass print as Twain knew it was already making libraries like the ones he had assembled feel old-fashioned, and he was worried about the future of books as he was interested in it. Born in Missouri in 1835, Twain's childhood reading would have consisted largely of cheap reprints of steady-selling early prose fictions, many of which had been heavily adapted and reimagined to suit rural American reading audiences. Sold by itinerant merchants alongside popular contemporary fiction, broadsides, chapbooks, pamphlets, and other cheap artifacts of the popular press. Early career experiments in printing, journalism, and riverboating gave the young Sam Clemens an unusual level of exposure to the inner workings of what Meredith McGill has called American literature's culture of reprinting. Its channels of distribution, its tendencies to dilute and distort the supposedly stable classics he would later winkingly disparage, and to give them new life in the process. There was, this is to say, never a moment in his reading life that Twain did not understand the novel genre as open to refashioning, chopping up, and being mined for its treasures and sold for its parts. But this sense of the novel's ready use value did not cheapen Twain's reverence for the form. The novels he liked were also, as he put it in his description of Don Quixote, examples of the symmetry and perfection of the firmament. Twain's ability to commit with equal insistence to a sense of the novel's mutability and its indelible and even divine cultural importance mirrors the historical reality of the form's circulation during his life and career, which unfolded in a marketplace that enabled Robinson Crusoe to exist both as a children's book, written in words of one syllable, and as a multi-volume reprint of Defoe's original edition, gifted to Twain by a friend and burnished by the inscription of an 18th century child, in which The Pilgrim's Progress could sit on his bookshelves both as a prestige copy that faithfully reproduced Bunyan's marginal notations and as a condensed translation into vernacular Cantonese or French or Hawaiian. He had all three of those, in which he would possess both a rare 1740 edition of Samuel Richardson's Pamela and an 1868 abridgment of the same author's follow-up, Clarissa, that was abridged very aggressively because reading audiences thought these books were so inappropriate. He never realized his plan to write, quote, a story in which pantaletted little children talked the stilted big word sentimental highfalutin of such works, but he was clearly interested in the effects of their circulation among young readers and other people excluded from past visions of the bourgeois literary audience. For Twain, vigorous transatlantic and transhistorical reprinting and all the changes and transformations that came with it were part of the machinery of cultural endurance. And he observed these phenomena with characteristic ambivalence. If he recognized abridgment, translation, reprinting, and revision as distortions, he also saw them as license to do something new with familiar plots, characters, and forms. Twain understood, this is to say, that an enduring literary reputation only came to those authors whose works were most open to interpretive challenge, whose embedded didactics or portraits of social life were sufficiently ambiguous to generate opposed and layered readings, and in turn to provoke publishers, printers, and booksellers to bring these readings to life in new editions, abridgments, and translations. For Twain, 18th century novels were not museum pieces. They were, as he put it in his notebook he kept in 1894, old-time literary mud idols, clay objects that existed to be reshaped, worn down, dried out, and dissolved by the forces of history, only to be resurrected and reconstituted by people like him. This metaphor has so much in it. Potters say that clay has memory. A lump of mud that wants to be a pot will always want to be a pot. It will change depending on whose hands shape it, to what purposes it will be put, how it is decorated, and where it is shelved, but it will nevertheless insist upon its status as a pot. Twain's novels work similarly. The whispers of plots, characters, themes, questions, and motifs that he borrows and reimagines, satirizes, and burlesques are indelibly there, even as they stridently object to elements of the source material they mine. And this tension was at the core of his method. For Twain, steady-selling early prose fictions were a little bit like the Bible, which he understood, to borrow Alan Gribben's formulation, as a collection of venerated stories with which his readers were familiar. This familiarity worked best when it was partial, gestural, when the feeling of knowingness left space for the suspension of disbelief, and when readers' commitment to what was actually there in a Robinson Crusoe or a Pilgrim's Progress or a Pamela or a Tom Jones had long since been eroded by print variants that had unsettled and thus cemented their cultural authority and brought them down to earth. That these works are often misread, misquoted, misattributed, or misunderstood is part of their usefulness, and Twain exploits that usefulness throughout his novelistic oeuvre, but perhaps to greatest effect in his most famous novel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The same forces that had resituated Gulliver's Travels and Robinson Crusoe as boys' books refashioned The Pilgrim's Progress into an adventure tale and placed Pamela at the center of 19th century debates about racialized domestic abuse, made it possible for Mark Twain to write The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, a work that, in Toni Morrison's words, is the argument it raises. And among the many productive conflicts that animate this novel is the question of the way novels circulate. Who does and does not get to read them? Where do they sit in the broader matrix of genres and media? What kinds of knowledge does novel reading afford or foreclose? And what source of social currency does it wield? Rather than banishing or correcting the problem of partial, failed, or licentious novel reading, Twain places it center stage. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn not only rehearses the forms and plots made famous by writers like Cervantes, Bunyan, and Defoe, it is also driven by its characters' misreadings of such works. A pristine copy of The Pilgrim's Progress sits on the Grangerford family's parlor table, which Huck, after a cursory glance, concludes, quote, is about a man that left his family and didn't say why. And Tom Sawyer's encounters with the Arabian Nights, Don Quixote, and the Count of Monte Cristo inspire a habit not just of reading adventure tales, but of acting them out. The literary culture Huck and his friends know is a swirl of 16th century drama, 17th century satire, 18th century translations, 19th century novels, histories, polemics, spiritual autobiographies, primers, and popular fiction. And without the supervision of educators or cultural tastemakers, the generic, temporal, national, and aesthetic boundaries between these forms vanish altogether. While the consequences of the commingling and interpenetration of early prose fictions, bestsellers, and popular forms tend to be vexed within the universe of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the novel itself is an unapologetic product of a print culture that made these disparate genres, forms, and traditions mutually legible. Though Twain is clearly worried about the ways that the obliteration of context and literary genealogy have disordered the literary landscape, he's also deeply interested in it, and his own work capitalizes on the leveling of historical, national, and aesthetic hierarchies. Like printers and abridgers who sought to modify early novels for new reading audiences, Twain set out to fold the picaresque, the adventure novel, the political satire, and the Bildungsroman into his vision of the American novel. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn thus functions much like an American reprint of Robinson Crusoe or Gulliver's Travels or Don Quixote, richly illustrated, generically unstable, and tempting the very forms of misreading and enchantment it purports to condemn. The result is a work that, rather than attempting to resolve the confusion of the post-Reconstruction United States, puts it on full display. The moral logic of Huckleberry Finn is as unstable as its prose is accessible. Twain created a book designed at once to elude and to appeal to the sorts of readers whose literary misadventures he puts on trial. It is also a book that takes these readers and non-readers seriously, both for the damage they can do and their capacity to enrich and reinvent literary and cultural traditions that have otherwise lost their relevance. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn enshrines the very literary history it sets out to interrogate and becomes, in its own afterlives, a contested, ambivalent, and interpretively unstable steady seller. Reading The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn in terms of its engagements with multiple and contradictory accounts of novel reading brings into focus two important but underappreciated dimensions of Twain's project. First, his interest in tracing the material, intellectual, and aesthetic legacies of early prose fictions as they circulated among non-literate and marginally literate Americans. And second, his investment in disentangling this circulation history from easy value judgments. For Twain, what is most interesting about the afterlives of familiar novels among new communities of readers is that they defy the assumptions cultural gatekeepers make about both the virtues and the risks associated with novel reading among the masses. The most important readers in the adventures of Huckleberry Finn are those whose literacy status is partial or provisional. But Twain does not dismiss them. Instead, he takes seriously the idea that the moral and political ramifications of steady-selling novels transform when people read them in unexpected ways. The redistribution of cultural capital through reprinted and modified texts, this is to say, has rendered the question of whether individual books are good or bad moot. What matters is how and by whom such books are copied, borrowed, excerpted, ignored, read aloud, displayed, summarized, Baudelarized, misremembered, or discarded, and in what political and social contexts those readers deploy their literary knowledge. Take, for example, the scene in which Huck decamps to Jackson Island after faking his own death. There's spoilers, by the way. Okay. It mimics the sort of Rousseauian reimagining of Robinson Crusoe that was popularized in early 19th century abridgments of Daniel Defoe's novel. He sets up a small camp, fishes, cooks, and feels pretty satisfied by the fruits of his labor. Eventually, he comes to believe that he is boss of the island. Quote, "It all belonged to me." Only when he discovers evidence of someone else's presence is his contented sense of ownership disrupted. Upon discovering, quote, "the ashes of a campfire that was still smoking," his heart jumps, he uncocks his gun and goes sneaking back on his tiptoes to hide in a tree. Like Crusoe, when he sees Friday's footprint in the sand, Huck experiences his threat to ownership over the island as a crisis. But when Huck discovers that the other person on the island is Jim, that sense of crisis immediately dissipates. Jim, on the other hand, is so startled by Huck's appearance that he drops to his knees begging for his life. Whereas Crusoe narrates his initial encounter with Friday as a scene of benevolent dominance and willing supplication, Huck registers that his own power over Jim is predicated on fear and misunderstanding. Defoe's fantasy of a fully naturalized racial hierarchy becomes, in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, a vexed examination of racialized power relations. The fact that Huck and Jim renovate this central episode in Defoe's novel without directly encountering or referring to the text itself suggests that Twain understands Robinson Crusoe as so fully integrated into U.S. American literary consciousness that one need not encounter the text itself to have internalized it. But this is not to say that the text or texts become irrelevant. As Twain explores the ways non-readers can exert new interpretive pressure on accepted narratives, he imagines a version of literary influence predicated not just on the scene of reading, but on the broader cultural mediation of canonical stories. In many ways, Twain's rendering of this scene anticipates Ian Watt's conception of Crusoe's transformation into what he calls, quote, "a myth of modern individualism." But whereas Watt imagines the text's abstraction into a simplified ideology, Twain conceives of non-readerly engagement with canonical narratives in terms that amplify the work's complexity, further destabilizing its presumably settled commitments. Rather than suggesting that material texts are consolidated into myths, Twain traces how the circulation of reprinted novels among non-literate, marginally literate, or newly literate readers transforms these texts into vehicles for questioning widely accepted ideas of the social order. Whereas Robinson Crusoe takes his encounter with Friday as an opportunity to act out in miniature the dynamics of colonialism and slavery, Huck and Jim question, albeit tentatively, familiar defenses of those systems. Though Huck worries he will be seen as, quote, "a low-down abolitionist," he decides to aid Jim in his quest for freedom. That narratives mediated through cultures of cheap print can both liberate and ensnare those who engage with them becomes most consequential in the final scenes of this novel. When Huck and Tom are reunited and Jim is imprisoned in a hut owned by Tom's aunt and uncle, the boys devise a way to free Jim using strategies drawn from novels. Tom, who has read the works in question, insists upon a strict adherence to both style and plot. It is not enough for their plan to succeed. It should generate drama. It must, as Tom puts it, make talk. For Tom, the difficulty of the escape justifies it both morally and aesthetically, an idea that's reinforced not only by the novels he has read, The Count of Monte Cristo is his primary source in these scenes, but also by charges that numerous self-emancipated writers had fabricated or embellished the details of their escapes. Quote, "You've got to invent all the difficulties," he explains to Huck. "There's more honor in getting them out through a lot of difficulties and dangers." It's Tom's attention to the problem of reception, however, that so powerfully estranges the material signifiers of escape from their practical functions. He imagines Jim's emancipation not in terms of its failure or success, but rather in terms of how it will be witnessed or read by other people. Huck, who has not read any of the novels Tom references, reluctantly agrees to follow the plan, raising reasonable objections from time to time, but capitulating to Tom's insistence that they adhere to the generic parameters of escape fiction. When Tom demands that Jim must keep a journal with homemade ink and found surfaces, Huck reminds him that Jim can't write. Quote, "That ain't got nothing to do with it, Huck Finn," Tom insists. "All he's got to do is write on a plate and throw it out. You don't have to be able to read it." Embedded in this exchange is a layered and deeply vexed commentary on the relationship between writing, circulation, reading, and imitation. In suggesting that Jim needs only to write and throw it out, Tom imagines circulation apart from actual reading, inviting the possibility that non-reading is as much a part of a text's reception as rigorous engagement. Relatedly, in dismissing the importance of Jim's illiteracy, Tom both acknowledges the participation of non-literate people in the culture of letters and endorses the ways in which literacy indexes social and racial power. It is Tom's own claims to superior literacy that allow him such influence over the semi-literate and non-literate Jim. The escape scene itself presents the novel's starkest illustration of the cost of Tom's disproportionate influence over their collective fantasy. The romanticism, madness, and humbuggery associated with the text's internal meditations on misreading all converge on the revelation that not only was the escape plot unnecessary, but that it also endangered Jim's life and freedom. In an attempt to produce as many obstacles to Jim's escape as possible, and thus to maximize the drama of the moment, Tom writes a series of threatening anonymous letters to Aunt Sally, warning of a plot to steal Jim. A gang of gun-wielding local farmers descends upon the cabin in hopes of catching the thieves in the act, but instead they shoot at Jim, Huck, and Tom, striking Tom in the leg. In order to treat Tom's wound, Huck is forced to seek out a doctor, which results not only in the revelation of their location, but also Jim's exposure. Jim, unwilling to watch Tom die, helps the doctor treat his wounds and is subsequently recaptured by a local search party. When Tom regains consciousness to discover Jim is once again in chains, he reveals that Jim was manumitted in Miss Watson's will after all. Tom's escape plan, we learn, is not the naive fantasy of an adventure-seeking child, but rather a long-running exploitation of Jim's fear and vulnerability at the hands of the slave system. When asked why he engineered such a dangerous and unnecessary plan, Tom states simply, "Why I wanted the adventure of it." Importantly, though Tom is the architect of Jim's enslavement, he is not its sole executor. His imagination games are rendered consequential through actions of other characters and the readiness with which they embrace the fear and suspicion he aims to cultivate. Objects that should look to the search party like the relics of a children's game are transformed in the broader context of a society both afraid of and determined to dominate Black people into signifiers of insurrection. The farmers believe that the sawing, digging, and writing they discover is the work of, quote, a dozen or even 40 men. They think the cabin has been, quote, covered over with secret African writing, and speculate that it might have even been ghosts who freed Jim. Tom's licentious novel reading, though certainly troubling on the level of the individual, is made so much more harmful when it is embraced by a wider contingent of racist white Southerners and incorporated into the existing matrix of societal beliefs, which are themselves fictions about the occult dimensions of Black resistance and the importance of maintaining Black bondage. One of the central questions of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, then, is also one of the central questions of the project from which this lecture is drawn. What is the relationship between the reception and circulation of early novels in the 19th century United States and the problem of social inequality during the same period? For Twain, the answer is determined by the uneven distribution of literacy. Fiction can be, by turns, a mode of liberation and a snare, and the extent to which it fulfills either of these functions is largely determined by the character's gender, class positions, and race, all of which correspond with uneven access to alphabetic literacy and literary knowledge. Though women and girls appear in scenes of devotional domestic reading, all of Twain's characters whose reading wields currency outside the home are boys or men. The king and the duke, though poor, benefit from the power of adult male whiteness and can thus exploit the terrain of fictionality to move undetected across barriers of class and identity. Whether their readings or reenactments of fiction are accurate has no bearing on their power. The cultural context through which they move neither recognizes nor rewards interpretive fidelity. Tom, though younger, is more securely ensconced in the protections of family and community. His readings, which are just as unorthodox as those perpetrated by the king and the duke, ripple out, shaping the actions and perceptions of other characters, often in disastrous ways. Huck often responds to Tom's unscrupulous readings with skepticism, but he just as often proves a willing participant in Tom's fantasies. For characters who lack even Huck's provisional literary education, Tom's readings represent an uncontested and uncontestable standard of literary knowledge. As a result, those characters become eager deputies in the unfettered circulation and dangerous reenactment of Tom's confused assemblage of novelistic fictions. And Jim, the person who is most fully excluded from both the advantages of literacy and the protections of white male identity, bears the brunt of other characters' narrative distortions, even as his own ethical commitments are shown in quiet exchanges with Huck to wield demonstrably more clarity than those presented by the novel's brokers of literary power. As Twain explores the potential upsides of literary inclusion, he also exposes literacy and literary knowledge as inadequate to the task of leveling racial and social hierarchies. Indeed, in Twain's imaginary reanimation of the antebellum Mississippi Delta, the interpretive flexibility of reprinted novels becomes yet another tool in the arsenal of white supremacy. In the spring of 1905, eager to distract himself from his wife's declining health, Mark Twain began a science fiction tale entitled 3,000 Years Among the Microbes. Set in the body of a Hungarian tramp named Blitzowski, the story is narrated by a man who has been transformed into a cholera microbe. Huck, as the narrator comes to be called, assimilates enthusiastically to his life as a germ and recounts in a Swiftian mock ethnography his adventures among the, quote, swarming nations of all the different kinds of germ vermin that live in Blitzowski's body. Unable to pronounce the names of the other microbes he meets, he, quote, invoices 45 literary favorites, calling his friends things like Lemuel Gulliver, David Copperfield, Guy Mannering, Sancho Panza, and Don Quixote. On the one hand, these famous literary names allow Huck to efface differences of nationality, ethnicity, and language. On the other, they represent a corpus of literary virality in their own right. Texts which have spread, multiplied, and mutated after the fashion of infectious diseases. The germ he names Don Quixote causes a recurrent fever and identifies himself with a crest emblazoned with a maze of hair snakes. Sancho Panza, a typhoid bacteria, is represented by jackstraws, which I think is pickup sticks, a game that literalizes the potential of a single event to disturb the collective equilibrium. Though this story was never published, it nevertheless helps to clarify Twain's evolving worries about the transatlantic, transhistorical passages of steady-selling literary texts. In Microbes, as in Huck Finn, beloved literary narratives fuel the characters' fantasies of glory, benevolence, and shared cultural consciousness, fantasies which ultimately enable acts of violence and destruction. What is more, Microbes introduces the possibility that Twain's own novel, which advances well-intentioned critiques of print culture's metastatic influence, has become the thing it feared. If you were not always a cholera germ, what were you before? Louis XIV asks Huck. Un-American, he replies. In his transformation from man to microbe, this reincarnation of Huck has also set U.S. ideologies loose in the world. Perhaps the suggestion seems to be that what began as an attempt to complicate and interrogate the most damaging mythologies upholding U.S. Southern racial and class hierarchies has produced even more unruly origin myths. In the process of its diffusion among new audiences, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn has suffered the same fate as the early novels whose legacies in print it set out to critique. To say that at the time he wrote Huck Finn, Twain was oblivious to this possibility, however, would be wrong. His early career literary experiments gave way to authorial celebrity thanks to the widespread, unauthorized reprinting of his short story, Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog. And by the time he began writing the sequel to Tom Sawyer, he was already intimately familiar with the consequences of transatlantic publishing. The original London edition of Tom Sawyer, printed in 1875, had been followed by 3 other European printings and a Canadian piracy, which meant by the time the work debuted in the United States in the December of 1876, many readers had already seen it. The international circulation of Tom Sawyer had suppressed U.S. sales so badly that it was less commercially successful than all the books he had published prior to its release. Nevertheless, the book attracted global notice. Reviewers from New York to Sydney worried that its depictions of hair-raising adventures would inspire bad behavior among the imitative youth. Rather than being discouraged from writing about the adventures of young boys, however, Twain redoubled his efforts. By the next summer, his plan for a sequel was fully in motion. Whereas he had insisted in an 1875 letter to William Dean Howells that Tom Sawyer was not a boy's book, by August 1876, he wrote to his friend again, announcing that he was 400 pages into the manuscript for, quote, another boy's book, Huck Finn's autobiography. In the decade between the two novels' publications, Twain learned a great deal about the advantages and perils of commercial publishing. He had made good money on a self-adhesive scrapbook. The blank book, free of the author's usual brand of controversial humor, would become one of the best-selling publications of his career. He published new books, and he sued a number of publishers for attaching his name to, quote, stuff which he never wrote. He saw his copyright lawsuits not only as a chance to defend his name, but also as a way to fight back against the industry-wide malpractice. By bringing attention to the breach of existing trademark laws, he hoped authors in literature of all kinds would, quote, be sheltered utterly from injury. Unfortunately, these lawsuits neither resulted in financial damages for Twain nor the more consistent enforcement of intellectual property laws. Moreover, Life on the Mississippi, a widely lauded transatlantic critical success, had been so expensive to produce and so undersubscribed that Twain lost much of the $50,000 he had personally invested in the project. Financially struggling after a series of such commercial miscalculations, Twain pursued a new strategy in his release of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, convinced that more control over the publication and circulation of his novel would yield better results. After cutting ties with his previous publisher, he established his own subscription printing business and hired his niece's husband, Charles Webster, to run it. He also secured a deal with the London publisher Chatto & Windus, who would solicit subscriptions in England and facilitate a transatlantic launch for the book. He hoped to have enough subscriptions lined up in time to catch the holiday trade, but he was also adamant that they would not publish until they had the capital to assure success. Quote, we don't issue Huck Finn till we have made a big sale, he wrote to Webster. If we haven't 40,000 orders, we simply postpone publication till we've got them. It's a plain, simple policy and would have saved both my last books had it been followed. Twain's subscription model, which he hoped would save his family from impending financial ruin, relied upon distributive fantasies of literary uplift. The very fantasies which actively obscured the financial setbacks that had bedeviled the reception of some of his earlier publications and cut against the work's internal skepticism about the liberatory power of literature among the working classes. In an advertisement printed in the Occidental Publishing Company's trade circular, Twain's West Coast publishers make a, quote, magnificent and unparalleled offer to canvassers, a chance to make money for all. By way of assurance that signing up to be an agent would pay off, the advertisement calls Twain's books, quote, the quickest selling in the world, citing over 500,000 copies of Mark Twain's books sold in this country alone, to say nothing of the immense sales in England and Germany. Twain wanted to persuade people that signing up for an agency with him was, quote, secure and easy work and sure pay within the reaches of all classes. And the idea of wide accessibility extended to his desire to appeal to as many different kinds of readers as he could. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn would be sold in 3 different formats, one in a fine English cloth binding with plain edges for $3.50, one in leather library with sprinkled edges for $4, and one in half Morocco marbled for $5.50. It was, the advertisement claimed, a book the people want. Not only was Twain interested in commercial success, but that success would be facilitated by ordinary working class people and would result in wide international cross-class dissemination. In order to attract the subscribers he courted, Twain had to secure an illustrator. Illustration had become a widely expected feature of novelistic fiction, and it was essential to the subscription publication model, which furnished canvassers with illustrated prospectuses designed to showcase the material features of a forthcoming book. He instructed Webster to reach out to E.W. Kemble, a 23-year-old artist whose drawings had appeared in Life magazine and in the New York Daily Graphic, but who was still at the dawn of his career. Kemble asked for $1,200 to complete the 197 plates Twain had requested, and Twain rushed to hire him. The results, however, fell far short of Twain's expectations. The exigencies of transatlantic subscription publication and his efforts to time the market pushed Twain to accept pictures he thought would just barely do. Over several months of back-and-forth communication, Twain urged Kemble to tone down the coarseness of the illustrations, attempting, as David Beverly puts it, to, quote, convert the cruelty and sexuality of the story into a series of humorous, boyish adventures. Not only did Kemble's illustrations outstrip Twain's attempts to discipline them, the racialized characters of Jim alone have led several critics to trace the image's violent reverberations in U.S. print culture. But somewhere in the process of sending the galleys to print, an engraver actively intervened to amplify the story's sexual suggestiveness. 3,000 advance copies of the book contained a version of an illustration that had been altered to show Uncle Silas exposing himself to Huck. As Huck loses himself in the fantasy of being Tom Sawyer, a boy who has the advantage of a large, supportive family, Kemble's defaced illustration repositions adult care for children as rooted in sexual predation. The appearance of these altered copies and the resulting public outcry led Twain to halt the U.S. publication of his book, which meant that it would debut not in the United States, but in London. In order to make up for the delay in his U.S. publications, Twain booked a 4-month speaking tour and sold the first 12 chapters of the novel to Century, where they were serialized alongside other notable forthcoming works. Once again, the dynamics of periodical reprinting amplified Twain's fame. Magazines and newspapers from the New York Sun to the Portland Oregonian to the Melbourne Times ran excerpts from the Century serial. Though the critical reception of these installments was initially tepid, Twain's speaking tour generated enthusiastic responses from audiences and reporters alike. By mid-December, when the book was released in Canada and England, Twain had succeeded in winning over his audience, at least temporarily. The British and Canadian press praised The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn for its entertainment value and its achievements as a distinctly American novel. As had happened in the case of Tom Sawyer, however, the book's success in Britain and Canada threatened the viability of its U.S. publication strategy. Shortly after the London release, Twain filed a lawsuit against the U.S. bookseller Estes and Laureate for advertising the work for 50 cents less than the cheapest version Twain's canvassers were offering to subscribers. Estes and Laureate insisted that Twain's true quarrel was with his canvassers, who had allegedly offered the discounted rate and refused to pull their advertisement. Estes and Laureate prevailed. A judge in the U.S. Circuit Court ruled that the booksellers had not violated any laws in advertising books which they had legally obtained at below market rates. Despite Twain's worries, the Estes and Laureate debacle did not appreciably damage subscription sales. Indeed, some speculated that the entire lawsuit was a publicity stunt designed to attract more attention to the work's forthcoming U.S. release. The combined controversies surrounding its publication and the months-long publicity efforts on the part of Twain, Webster, and their partners led the San Francisco paper Alta California to name The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, quote, probably the best advertised book the country had ever seen. And the result was commercial success that defied widespread critical dismissal of the work's vulgar and pernicious humor. What had struck English reviewers as Twain's uniquely American literary inventiveness inspired moral panic and aesthetic dismissal among the arbiters of U.S. literary culture. The book was banned from the Concord Library at the urging of Louisa May Alcott and Edward Emerson, and a national conversation about its censorship ensued. But Huckleberry Finn's critics only fueled its commercial success. In a letter to Charles Webster, Twain gloated that in their zest for, quote, expelling Huck from their library as trash and suitable only for the slums, the Concord literati had unwittingly sold 25,000 copies for us, for sure. And indeed, Twain was right. In the years since he penned those letters, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn would go on to become a steady-selling, highly canonical, often reprinted, abridged, and adapted novel in its own right, its popularity fueled by its interpretive and generic ambiguity, and its author's strategic, if sometimes ambivalent, openness to the culture of reprinting. By turns lauded as a tale of interracial camaraderie and condemned for its racist language, dismissed as aesthetically compromised and extolled as a fresh innovation in American letters, referred to by some as a children's book and by others as a book wholly inappropriate for impressionable young readers, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn remains today at the center of debates about the political and moral ramifications of the American novel. Thank you.